The sport of rock climbing involves the climber ascending rock formations, either natural or man-made pre-designed climbing problems. The goal of this sport is to reach the top of the formation or endpoint of the route without falling. Rock climbing is a physically exhausting sport that often challenges the climber's endurance and agility. We visited the River Rock indoor rock climbing facility in Roanoke, Virginia, to get a first-hand experience of rock climbing. We analyzed each joint of the body in the 4 phases of motion: stance, prep, movement, and the follow-through.
To get this analysis started, we're going to look at the stance phase in the upper extremity. In the right elbow, you have isometric extension, as the climber's hand is resting on a higher rock in the starting position. The climber is using both flexors and extensors in order to hold this position. The left elbow is also in an isometric state, however, it's resting in flexion. Since this is also isometric, it uses both flexors and extensors. Moving on to the shoulder girdle, you can see that the right side is in upward rotation as the inferior angle of the scapula points laterally. The movement is in an isometric state, which indicates that the muscles used for both upward and downward rotation must be used in order to hold on. The left side of the shoulder girdle is in elevation as the climber seems to be holding her shoulder more superiorly than the rest of her trunk. The left is once again in an isometric state. Next, we look at the shoulder joint. The right side can be seen in flexion with an isometric contraction occurring because the arm must be held up in that position. The left side is in a combination of flexion and internal rotation as the arm is out in front of the body, but also being positioned more medially. Now we can look at the rest of the climber. Both the left and right sides are seen in the neutral position, which is the term used for the wrist being held in anatomical position. Both are also being held in isometric contraction. Close by, we can analyze the fingers, which are holding onto the rocks by using concentric flexion. This is the only position in the stance phase that does not have an isometric contraction, because the active motion of holding onto the rock is concentric. Because of the position of the hands, both the radial ulnar joints are in pronation, which is seen in the palms of the hands being faced towards the rocks. They are also in isometric contraction.
To continue on, we will look at the cervical spine and trunk. In the stance phase, the lumbar spine is in a neutral position with an isometric contraction occurring. This contraction requires the work of both the flexors and extensors to maintain the position. The cervical spine is in isometric extension while the climber is looking in the direction of the next rock. For the cervical spine to be in isometric extension, this motion must activate the flexors and extensors. From the cervical spine and trunk, we move to the hip-pelvic girdle. When looking at this joint, the left side appears to be in isometric extension and external rotation. For this motion to occur, the extensors and flexors of the hip joint are activated. On the right side of the body, the hip is again experiencing external rotation, but it is in flexion. These motions are still in isometric contraction. The muscles used for external rotation are the same for the right as for the left. Continuing, the next distal joint is the knee. For the stance phase of movement, both the left and right knees are in isometric flexion. Because this motion is isometric, it will require activation of both the knee flexors and extensors. Next, we will look at the foot and ankle joints. The left foot and ankle is in isometric plantar flexion. The joint is also in slight isometric supination. The toes are resting isometrically in transverse tarsal and subtalar inversion. This position uses inverters and everters. There is also isometric metatarsal, phalangeal, and interphalangeal flexion in the big toe. In addition to this action, there is distal phalangeal flexion in the 2nd through 5th phalanges. The foot and ankle joint of the right side are maintaining the same motions, except that the foot is in dorsiflexion rather than plantar flexion, due to the placement of the rock holds. The contraction is still isometric.
Before movement can occur, the body naturally must cock into position to prepare for the motion. We will start the analysis prep phase back at the elbow. The right elbow continues to be in extension, however, because of the movement of cocking the joint, the contraction becomes concentric instead of isometric. This indicates that the muscles being used change to only the extensors. The left side also moves into a concentric flexion contraction for the same reason. The shoulder girdle also changes its contraction type to concentric on both sides from isometric. The motion changes to concentric upward rotation in the right shoulder girdle. The left side of the shoulder girdle is now in concentric elevation. Next, we can see that both shoulder joints also change from isometric to concentric. The left shoulder joint is now in concentric flexion and internal rotation. The right shoulder joint is now in concentric flexion. The wrist remains in neutral, however, the contraction changes to concentric. The muscles being used do not change. The fingers do not change at all from the previous position, as they have not let go of the rock. The radial ulnar joints contractions change from isometric to concentric, as it will also cock into position like many of the other joints.
From the radial ulnar joint, we will look to the cervical spine and trunk. On the left side, the cervical spine is remaining in extension. However, the contraction has changed to concentric. The lumbar spine is experiencing lateral lumbar flexion to the left. This motion is again concentric. The right side is experiencing the same motions. Next, we move distally towards the hip and pelvic girdle. Both the right and left sides are experiencing external rotation concentrically. The right and left sides differ due to extension in the left and flexion in the right side. Both of these motions are concentric. The knee joint motions in prep phase are concentric flexion in the left knee. The right knee is experiencing the same motion. Finishing with the foot and ankle joint, the left foot is in concentric plantar flexion. The foot is also in concentric supination. There is concentric transverse tarsal and subtalar inversion. The toes are remaining in a concentric flexed position at each of the phalangeal joints. Each of these positions are the same for the right foot and ankle except for plantar flexion. The right foot is in concentric dorsiflexion.
Now the action begins as we transition into the movement phase of this climb. The right elbow will change into flexion as it concentrically bends, while the left elbow does the opposite by concentrically moving into extension in order to grab onto a higher rock. The left elbow switches, utilizing flexors, and the right elbow switches utilizing extensors. The right shoulder changes into downward rotation. The left shoulder girdle changes into upward rotation as the climber reaches for the rock. Both sides are concentrically contracting as the movement is actively occurring. The left shoulder joint concentrically transitions into diagonal adduction. The right shoulder joint concentrically transitions into normal adduction. The right wrist remains exactly the same as in prep phase. The left wrist transitions concentrically into extension. The fingers on the right hand are in the same position as in prep phase. The fingers on the left hand, however, move concentrically into extension as the hand is letting go of the rock in order to get ready to grasp a higher rock. The radial ulnar joint on the right side goes into slight supination as the hand lifts up. The left radial ulnar joint remains the same as in prep phase.
Following the radial ulnar joint in the movement phase, I will begin with the cervical spine and trunk. The cervical spine remains in the same concentric extended position, recruiting the same muscles as in the prep phase. The lumbar spine changes from lateral lumbar flexion to the left to lateral lumbar flexion to the right. This motion is still concentric and will involve the same muscles as in the prep phase. Next, we will look at the hip and pelvic girdle in the movement phase of motion. The hip joint in the movement phase will change from extension in the left hip to flexion, and from flexion in the right hip to extension as the climber pushes off with one leg and raises the other to reposition the lower leg. The hip also remains in the same external rotation as before, concentrically contracting. The knee joint will follow the hip and pelvic girdle. The left knee will remain in concentric flexion to allow for placement on a higher rock hold. The right knee moves into concentric extension as there is a push-off to allow for a greater left knee flexion. Finally, the foot and ankle joint in the movement phase will look differently as the left foot moves from concentric plantar flexion to concentric dorsiflexion. This motion occurs as the left foot transfers from a lower rock hold to a higher on the waterfall wall. The right foot will move from dorsiflexion to concentric plantar flexion. This motion occurs due to the change of weight placed on the foot and elevation of the rest of the body up the wall. The remainder of the foot and ankle will remain the same from supination of the foot to the joints of the phalanges as in prep phase.
The follow-through phase occurs in the quick moment after the main motion has occurred, as the body is trying to slow itself down. Both of the elbows remain in the same type of movement, but their contraction changes to eccentric as the joints are now trying to slow the movement down. This means that the right elbow is in eccentric flexion using the opposing muscles. The left elbow is doing the exact opposite of the right elbow. The right shoulder girdle is still in downward rotation but is contracting eccentrically. The left shoulder remains in upward rotation but is eccentrically contracting. The left shoulder joint maintains diagonal adduction but is in eccentric contraction. The right shoulder is in an eccentric adduction contraction using the upper pectoralis muscle. The right wrist is in slight flexion, but also eccentric contraction. The left wrist is also now in flexion, as it has now grasped a new rock. The fingers on the hands are now in concentric flexion, as they have once again begun to grasp a new rock. Both of the radial ulnar joints are now in eccentric pronation, using the opposing muscles of pronation.
The follow-through phase of the cervical spine and trunk is as follows. The cervical spine will remain in concentric extension because the head and neck need to be stabilized constantly. The muscles will remain the same as they have for this entire motion analysis. The lumbar spine will again be in lateral lumbar flexion to the right, but the contraction will be eccentric as the muscles of the lumbar spine work to slow the motion down. The next joint is the hip and pelvic girdle. For follow-through, the movements will be the same, but the contraction type will change as the body attempts to slow and hold itself. The left hip joint will be in eccentric flexion. The right hip will be in eccentric extension. Both hip joints will remain in external rotation while eccentrically contracting the muscles. The knee joint is next. The left knee remains in flexion, however the contraction type is eccentric. Therefore, the muscles involved will transition to the extensors rather than the flexors. The right knee remains in extension, however the contraction type here will be eccentric. Finally, the foot and ankle joint and follow-through will remain in the same position or motion, however the contraction type here will be eccentric or for dorsiflexion, transverse tarsal and subtalar inversion, and supination in the left and right foot. Flexion in the toes will remain the same as the movement phase for both the right and left foot. This change in contraction type occurs as the body maintains position and acts to slow the motion of the body.
As you can see, rock climbing requires movement from every joint in the body. This sport tests the body and its ability to exert enough force and stamina to reach to the top and move from one rock to the next. Rock climbing problems or rock setups can depend varying on location and the individuals who create them. There are varying levels of difficulty which test the body even further with more complicated movements. This concludes our motion analysis of rock climbing.